you. And we're going to look at Matthew chapter 20, verse 17. I'm not going to give a big intro today because I want to get right into the text. Matthew chapter 20 and verse 17. It says, "Now Jesus was going up to Jerusalem. On the way, he took the 12 aside and said to them." Now, we're going to be going several different places, but I want you to keep your Bible open to Matthew chapter 20. So when I take you to other places, if you're really, really fast, you might be able to catch me, but it'd probably be better just to stay right there in Matthew 20. So they're on their way to Jerusalem, and you kind of get the picture that it's not just them. Most likely, there's a group of people that are heading on their way for Passover in Jerusalem. And so you've got crowds that are possibly with Jesus, some of his extended disciples, and also people, just normal people on their way to worship the Lord for the Passover. So they're all heading in this direction towards Jerusalem, and Jesus calls his 12 disciples aside, and he wants to tell them something very important. Now, you may not realize it, but what he's about to share with them, he's already told them twice before. So this is the third time that Jesus speaks this to him, so it is very important. He says, "We are going up to Jerusalem." Now, as you notice, that's the title of my message today, We Are Going. And often we could look at this and skip right over this, but I want you to, sometimes I don't like it when preachers do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. Would you say with me, we are going? Okay, keep that in your mind. So we are going up to Jerusalem. Now, what in the world does that mean? We are going up to Jerusalem. Why is that the important thing that I want you to remember today? Let's continue on in verse 18. "We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law." Now, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of focus in on each one of the main words of what Jesus is saying here. He's saying, we are going up, and the Son of Man, speaking of himself, will be delivered over. Let's stop and think about that. In Matthew chapter 26 and verse 47, we see this picture of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's already travailed in prayer. The three other disciples are right beside him. The other disciple is a little further on, and he gets up, and here's what takes place. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him a large crowd armed with swords and clubs. Picture it there. You've got these people carrying these clubs. You've got people with swords. The temple guard, they're coming, and they are sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Then the men, and we don't have time to go into the whole story, but then the men stepped forward, they seized Jesus and arrested him. Verse 55, "In that hour, Jesus said to the crowd, 'Am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with your swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled.'" Now I want you to stop and think about this in light of we are going. So when Jesus looks at his disciples, he calls them aside and he says, we are going up to Jerusalem. In his mind, he is also playing through what's going to happen. He's telling them, I'm going to go to Jerusalem. And you know what's going to happen in Jerusalem? I'm going to be delivered up. And you see this image of this crowd that's coming, temple officials with clubs, with sword, and they take him, but they don't just take him, they deliver him. They're going to take him somewhere. Verse 57, "Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled." So he tells them, no matter the fact that we're going to face this crowd, armed crowd, and they're going to take me by force, we are still going. So let's read further on. "We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to" who? "The chief priests and the teachers of the law." So let's stop and think, yeah, they're delivering him. Let's think about for a minute the people that he's being delivered to. Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, we see that Jesus confronts them and he says, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, how did you think the teachers of the law felt about this? They weren't too happy, okay? Because that meant that they weren't making it. Now, Jesus also challenged them with their hypocrisy and the burdens that they put unneedingly on the people. Look at Luke 5:30, another instance with the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. It says, they who belong to their sect complained to his disciples, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" And so these teachers of the law that Jesus is going to be handed over to thought that he was a sinner because he was hanging around with the tax collectors, the sinners, the bad guys. Luke 53. When Jesus went outside, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law began to oppose him fiercely and to besiege him with questions, waiting to catch him in something he might say. So not only is Jesus going to be delivered to people that he has spoken against, not only is he going to be delivered to these people that he has accused of being hypocrites, he's going to be placed in their hands, and they are waiting to catch him. They've been waiting for him to trip up, to say something that he shouldn't say. We see that further happening in Luke 6, verse 7. It says, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Have you ever had somebody watching you so close, they're waiting for you to trip up? Yeah, they're looking for that time. It's a lot of pressure. And so Jesus is going to be placed into the hands of people who are looking for him to mess up. But yet he says, we are going up to Jerusalem. Luke 6:11 says that the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. This is after Jesus healed somebody on the Sabbath, and they are furious about that. Not only are they looking for him to mess up, now they're looking for a way that they might do something to Jesus. John chapter 7, verse 31 says, many in the crowd believed in Jesus. They said, when the Messiah comes, will he perform more signs than this man? Let's hear what the Pharisees said about this. Verse 32, the Pharisees heard the crowd whispering such things about him. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees sent temple guards to arrest him. So they were upset about it as well, the chief priests. Finally, the temple guards went back to the chief priests and the Pharisees, who asked them, why didn't you bring him in? So they sent him because they wanted to arrest Jesus. The temple guard said, we didn't do this. Here's what they say. No one ever spoke the way this man does, the guards replied. And here's what they answered. You mean he has also deceived you? So Jesus is going to be handed over to the people that he's called hypocrites, for the people that are looking for him to trip up, for the people that want to do something to him. And now he is listed as a deceiver. He's going to be delivered over to people that think he is a deceiver. Verse 48 finishes the story. They say to the people, have any of the rulers of the Pharisees believed in him? How many of them, according to this guy? None. Now we know that Nicodemus later speaks up. But this is the overwhelming feeling of the rulers and the Pharisees at this time. But this mob that knows nothing of the law, there is a curse on them. So again, when Jesus takes his disciples aside and says, we're going up to Jerusalem, he has in his mind the crowd that's coming to get him with the clubs and the sword. He has in his mind that he is being delivered to the people that he has called hypocrites, the people that think that he is a deceiver. They're waiting for him to trip up. They want to do something to him. He is being delivered to that group of people. Now, what happens when he is going to be delivered to him? Jesus says to his disciples, they will condemn him. Let's stop and talk about what that means. What does the word condemn mean? It means to pronounce judgment upon someone, to sentence them. Now, can you believe the arrogance and the nerve for someone to judge who? The judge of all, right? Can you imagine let's pick I wish I could pick out somebody here. Someone out of this whole crowd that you would never suspect of doing anything. Okay? You want to pick somebody? Pick that one person in your head. Just look around the crowd just for a minute. Who would you think would absolutely not be guilty of anything? If you could pick one, right? Now, I want you to imagine that they're being brought into court, but who are they going to be judged by? They're going to be judged by the mob. Okay? What would you think about that? Would you think that that's a fair trial? No, they are wicked people that are going to be judging them. And so here, these groups of people that were not perfect are judging the only innocent one, Jesus. The wickedness of sentencing God in flesh among us. Jesus knew that he, the only righteous judge, would be subjected to the judgment of wicked men who would find everything he did on behalf of them and all of us. He's going to find that worthy of punishment and is going to pronounce that judgment against him. So Jesus, when he talked to his disciples, knew that he would be dragged off, that he would be brought to this group, and they would condemn him. They would make that sentence over his life, declaring him guilty and sentencing him. Now, what would that sentence be? It says, they will condemn him to death. They would believe that his crimes were worthy of death. Jesus knew that going to Jerusalem meant going to the place where his life would be ended. And I love this. It's kind of hard to say that, right? Because his life is not going to be ended. It's ended for a time, not really the end, but we know that God will raise him up. And I believe that he knew that as well. So all these are going to happen. And verse 19 says, and will hand him over. Okay, so before we get any further here, we could look at the Jewish people here, and some people have been guilty of doing this. They've said it's all the Jewish people's fault. You know, they rejected Jesus. They did that, and they did this. And as a whole, did they do this? Not all of them. You know, the disciples are evidence of this. But the leading people, on behalf of the people, did reject. So if I stopped right there, we'd cause some really problems. But it doesn't stop there. We see verse 19. And in verse 19, we're going to see that the guilt is spread to all of us. So it says, and will hand him over. Now, imagine for a minute, you've been guilty, Vic has been guilty of stealing something. And so he's brought to our court. And that's not a good thing. But just imagine that he was brought. Instead, our government didn't want to deal with him because they didn't think they were being strict enough on Vic, and so they sent him to Iran to be judged. What would you think in that moment? Would you be a little bit more worried? Yeah, because they might not give you the same respect that you would get in the United States. You know, you might get a fair meal. You wouldn't be mistreated in prison. You'd be safe there. And yes, you're going to suffer judgment, but it's not going to be near as bad as if you were in another place. But here, Jesus' own people took him and they handed him over. And Jesus, when he talked to his disciples, knew that he would be handed over. Matthew chapter 26, verse 66. The chief priests said, "What do you think?" And they answered, "He is worthy of death." Verse 67, then they spit in his face, struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Messiah, who hit you?" Luke 23:1 tells us, then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate. They handed him over to the Gentiles. They could not enforce the sentence, the punishment, so they had to hand him over to others who could. Let's look at verse 19 again. And so they will hand him over to who this time we're going to look at? To the Gentiles. He would be handed over to the government that was responsible for killing innocent babies while trying to kill him. Do you remember that story? We talk about that at Christmas time. The babies, basically 2 years and younger, were killed in that area in attempts to kill him. That was the government that he is being handed over to. He would be handed over to the government that was oppressing the people. Sometimes we have a skewed view of what it was like, but the Romans were not really nice people. They did terrible things to the people of God. So he's going to be handed over to the Gentiles for what reason? He's going to be mocked. Let's look at Matthew chapter 27 and verse 27. We're going to see how Jesus is mocked. It says, "Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him." Just stop. I don't want you to rush past this because I want you to see in your mind what Jesus knew that he would face, and he told his disciples about it. He would be stripped of his clothes, and instead they would put a scarlet robe on him, like a robe of royalty, but it was not to honor him. It was to mock him. Verse 29 says, "And then they twisted together a crown of thorns and placed that on his head," again to mock him as a so-called king. They put a staff in his right hand, and then they knelt in front of him and mocked him. Just picture it in your head just for a moment, what Jesus took. Stripped of his clothes, crown of thorns, the robe on him, the staff in his hand, and then in the worst way possible, they are mocking him. "Hail, King of the Jews," they said to him. They spit on him. They took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. The soldiers also came up and mocked him. This is when he was on the cross. They offered him wine vinegar and said, "If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself." In this way they mocked him. Now I want you to remember that when Jesus said, "We are going," he said it in full knowledge of that scene being played out, of him being beat, being spit upon, being mocked by these people that were not even his own people, made fun of. So he'd be handed over to the Gentiles to be mocked. Not only that, to be flogged. To be flogged by a whip that contains bits of rocks or glass meant to rip in the flesh. I showed you this in times past, called Cat of Nine Tails. And in each one of these 9, there were bits of rocks and glass. And every time that they whipped, it would attach to the back, and then they would pull it back and would rip bits of flesh off of Jesus' back. Now, I just took Micah and some of our kids to get our flu shots. Some of you gotten flu shots, right? It's not that bad, right? You have the shot, the initial shot, and a little bit of pain after that. And Micah is asking me this question over and over again. He said, "Dad, is it going to hurt?" Parents, what do you say to that? Well, it's going to hurt a little bit. Yeah, not that bad. And so Brianna was our great actor. She had to go right before Micah had his shot, and she got her shot. And Micah asked, "How bad was it?" And Brianna, what was your exact words?
"Oh, it doesn't hurt at all."
Okay, so Micah's right here. Micah passes, and she goes, like that. Yeah. And so, but a lot of times that fear of the shot is a lot worse than it really is, right? Can you imagine telling your kids 5 days in advance, "You're going to get a shot, and it's going to hurt." Man, they're going to be ready to scream by the time they get in this chair, right? Now, I want you to think about this just for a minute. Jesus knew exactly what he was getting into. Notice the words, flogged. Jesus told his disciples, when he said, "We are going," he knew that his flesh would be ripped open 39 times and that he would have to endure that. But yet he still says, "We are going." Be delivered to the Gentiles, to be mocked, to be flogged, and to be crucified. To be crucified, he had to be stripped of his clothing. He was nailed to the cross, his hands, feet. A slow, painful suffocation. That's basically what's happening on the cross. He's trying to hold himself up to be able to breathe. And then when he can't hold on any longer, it goes down like this, and your body cannot breathe in that position for long. And so the slow and painful, suffocating process where fluid is filling up his lungs until finally he cannot breathe anymore. Again, we went over this, but it was a humiliating thing as well. Here, the people that would follow him, here the God of all the universe is stripped bare in front of everyone, beaten, struggling to breathe. It was a shameful death. So to add to this, what else did Jesus know when he said, "We are going"? I believe that he knew that his disciples would abandon him. I believe he knew, and the other instances talk about the betrayal of Judas. He knew that Judas would betray him, someone close to him. He knew that he would carry the weight of our sin. I believe he knew when he was on the cross that there would come a moment as he's carrying the weight of our sins on his shoulder that the Father would have to look away, and for that one moment in all of creation, he is not connected with the Father. He feels that distance between him and the Father as he takes on the sin of the world, and he says, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" in that moment. But yet, knowing all of this, what did he say to his disciples? We are going. Just stop and think about that. In his mind, all of that plays through his mind, but yet he tells his disciples, we are going. Have you ever said no to God because you knew what was going to happen if you said yes? God asks you to do something, and you say, the cost, God, is a little bit too high. I don't know if I can do this or not. Obedience is not always easy. The rich young ruler could tell us that. He went away sad because he wasn't willing to obey, to give all of his riches and to follow after Jesus. The prophets of old could have told you that because when they prophesied, some of them were put in pits for what they were teaching. Many of them suffered because of what they were sharing, but yet they obeyed. It's one thing to do something that will put your life in danger because you're forced to. For instance, if somebody had a gun up to your head and asked you to do something very difficult, you would still do it, right? Because you had to, or you would die. But yet with Jesus, it was different than that. It's another thing to boldly charge forward, putting your life in danger because of your love for others. Jesus knew every single thing that would happen to him, but he said we are going because he was thinking of you and he was thinking of me. It's another thing to boldly charge forward, putting your life in danger because it's the right thing to do, is what God the Father brought him here for, is to accomplish this for us. It was the right thing for him to do in that moment. And so here is the transitional statement that I want to ask each of you, and I want you to pray in your heart about this one. Would you say, we are going? If you knew you would face every single thing that Jesus faced, would you say, we are going? Would you do it? Or how about a tougher question? Take a deep breath for a minute. Will you do it? Here's the good news. Last part of 19. Jesus also knew this. On the third day, he will be raised to life. God the Father always had the plan that God the Son would be raised to life after paying the penalty for our sin. Now, some of you may be tempted to say, well, Jesus could go through all these things because he knew he would live after that. Everything was going to be okay, and so he could do all those things. But I don't have that assurance. Well, don't you? Right? If you give your life for Christ here, what do you have the promise of? Heaven. Right? You have that same promise of being raised to life. There was a reward waiting for Jesus because of his sacrifice. There is a reward waiting for us as we sacrifice for him as well. Now, I debated going any further. I'm just going to really quick hit a few verses right after this. I want you to look at verse 21 if you're following along there in Matthew chapter 20. James and John's mother came to Jesus and said, "Grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom." What is she asking? Lord, can they have a place of authority? Can they be like second in command? And Jesus said to them in verse 22, "You don't know what you're asking." That's what Jesus said to him. Have you ever signed up for something and you didn't know what you're getting into? Like, maybe some of you signed up for Sunday school and you didn't know how you were going to be blessed, right? Maybe you signed up for football not knowing that you're going to get your head knocked off, right? Many different areas where you can sign up and you don't know the whole picture. And here Jesus was saying to James and John, you're asking for this place of authority, but you don't know the cost that's going to come at this place of authority. Being used by God to do great things often requires great sacrifice. And so the question Jesus asked them, I want to ask you too. Can you drink the cup I am going to drink? Now those words, the cup, has a tie into the Passover, that cup of suffering. Can you drink this cup of suffering that I am going to drink? Now, James and John said pretty quickly, it looks like, we can. We'll do it. We're up for this, God. And did they understand the whole package? I don't believe they understood the whole package, but in their hearts, they wanted to serve God completely. Verse 26, whoever wants to become, this is the words of Jesus, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. So you're thinking about this authority. You're not thinking about the cost. You're not thinking about what I really want. If you want to be great, here's what you do. You become a servant. This is not a new thing. Jesus has talked to them about this many times. Verse 27, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Here's the last verse we're looking at today. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So serving God, fulfilling your calling, means living a life of service and sacrifice. I'm going to skip past this, and I want to end on this today. Will you, like Jesus, see the cost and still say, we are going? So here's the truth. You may not have to go through the beating, the sacrifice on your life that Jesus did. But your call may be the call that he gives to the disciples there. If you want to do something great for God, how do you do that? You become a what? A servant. You become a slave. You treat others as better than yourself. How many of you in the moment, like when somebody says something really mean to you, you want to just light into them. And there's this like holy zeal in you, right? In that moment. Maybe God in that moment would have you be a servant and treat somebody as better than yourself and love in that moment in spite of. That's not that easy, is it? But yet it's something that God has called us to. Will you stand with me? And if you wouldn't mind, just bow your heads and close your eyes. I want you to picture it in your mind one last time, and then I'm going to ask you that one last question. Jesus, before going up, understood that he would be handed over, that he would be delivered over to the chief priests, the teachers of the law, people that did not like him, that would try everything to destroy him, that they would condemn him, judging the one true God, that they would mock him, make fun of him, that they would deliver him over to the Gentiles, an unholy nation, unholy people group, known for wicked things, that they would beat him, torture him, that he would face all of those things. He would be put to death. All of those things he would face for each and every one of us, but yet, because he loved you, and I want you to insert your name there. because he loved Joel, he said, we are going. Because he loved John, because he loved Jonah, he said, I am going. We are going up to Jerusalem. And so here before you, we're called to be Christians, right? That means to be Christ-like. And I ask you the question that he asked his disciples. Are you willing to drink the cup that I drink of? Are you willing to say, I'm going to follow you, God, no matter what? No matter what it is that you ask me, I'm going to do it. We are going. Now I want to get very specific in your life. And I'm going to need your help. I wish I could pick your brains, each one of you, and pick that perfect thing that's right where you're at. But I'm going to throw a few out, and if I don't say yours, you put it there. Maybe you're struggling in your relationship with your spouse. And you know what God has called you to do. He's called you to be obedient in some different areas. But yet you're bucking that. You don't want to give up your rights. I want to ask you the question. Are you going to say, we're going? We're going to do what God wants me to do no matter what I have to suffer for it. I'm going to be obedient to what God wants me to do. Maybe it's a sin that you're holding on to. Are you going to say, I'm going to do what God wants me to do? We are going up no matter how hard it is, no matter what I face, I'm going to do this for God. Or maybe it's not sin, but it's something that God has called you to do. And you know what's going to happen if you step up to it. You know the difficulty that comes along with that task that God has given you to do. Will you give up in that moment? Or will you say, we are going. No matter what it is, God, that you want me to do, I'm going to do it. Jesus has already set the example for us. And no matter what you face on this earth, no matter how bad it might be, here's the truth. Just like Jesus was raised on that third day, if we are faithful to God, we will receive the blessings of heaven and so much more. I want you to search your heart right now. What is the Lord speaking to you about? What is the cup that he is asking you to take? I'm not going to have any music, anything else right now. But as you think about that, if the Lord brings something to your mind that he is asking of you, and you're right now in your mind, you're weighing the cost of what that is. If you are ready to sacrifice and say, God, I'm willing to do it. We are going. If that's you today, would you just come find a place at this altar, and may these steps that you take up to the altar be your commitment to God, saying, I am going, Lord. Whatever it is you ask me to, I will do it.